we have with us on the webinar Mr. Tom Shields, the boys director at STA, and Steve Fell, who is a performance expert here at Beyond Pulse, who's also on the call. As a quick summary, we originally started this case study looking at two teams for STA, the 04 and 03 boys teams who are competing in the National Cup, US Club Soccer's National Cup finals. And we are just going to review some of the data of that week and have a discussion around some of the things that we saw. So Tom, can you just give us a quick summary of how the week went?
I can. The week was very good, Michael. It was the 04s won their group stage, going 3-0, and then unfortunately lost by a goal in the semi-finals against Eclipse from Chicago. So delighted for those guys in their first national event to make the Final Four. And the 03s actually managed to win the whole thing. So third time of trying, they became national champions, which obviously everybody was absolutely delighted with. And the boys did tremendous. Obviously 5 games in 5 days was a huge task, but they went through the whole event unbeaten and yeah, managed to get over the line. So delighted for them and a great achievement for everybody concerned.
That's yeah, that's fantastic, mate. Congratulations. So just to review a little bit your plan for the week, can you quickly summarize again? I know you had 2 training days ahead of the tournament. Can you just give us an overview again of what your plan was for that week, and ultimately how did it go?
Yeah, so well, I'll go one step further back. We basically had a 2-week build up once we knew that both teams would be heading out to Denver. So both teams trained on the Tuesday and Wednesday, the week preceding the final travel or preparation week. And then we trained on the Tuesday night, which was the evening of our first conversation. And then we trained on the Thursday once we arrived in Denver. We had an hour session to try to acclimate and adjust. And then obviously the games began on the Friday. So the plan was for the Tuesday, we wanted to go for roughly 75 minutes, work when we needed to work. And obviously, you know, for me, it was important that we maintained a relatively high intensity to the practice when the players were active, but we exaggerated some of the rest periods, made sure that obviously the sizes relative to the area, there was a lot of involvement, but minimal space that was necessary to be covered. So I think that the statistics showed that, you know, while the AP score again was moderate, you know, 60-ish%, and the distance covered was again very moderate, maybe around 4,000 as the team average. Obviously the time above 80% was up there. I think, you know, around half an hour. So while it was hot, it also suggested that, you know, the boys were stretching themselves. So really it was, let's keep it sharp, but let's not flog them too much. Let's make sure that, you know, their work rate is appropriate, but we're not hammering their legs, and we're not putting them through too much stress and increasing the physical workload too much before obviously a big event and too much travel. And then very similar on the Thursday, it was more of a heavy emphasis on kind of just technical, you know, a technical introduction to playing on grass. Again, exaggerated rest periods. So we were working in pretty much 90-second intervals for the first third of the practice, just to get people going. But again, give them plenty of opportunities to stop, take a break, catch their breath. Obviously, training at 9,000 feet was strange for many of them, and still I think we landed at, my rental car showed 112 degrees the day that we landed, so it was crazily warm. But again, it was an hour start to finish, finished with, you know, some functional phase of play stuff, pattern play to goal, nothing that's overly mentally or physically taxing, but was just enough to keep, you know, to keep them moving, to keep the football at the feet, and yeah, just open up their lungs a little bit, but not too much where it was going to do anything to negatively hinder their ability to produce once the games began.
Yeah,
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 for sure.
for sure.
I'd love
I'd
to just
love
actually
to actually.
ask Steve a question here. Steve, to your knowledge, going into a tournament where you're potentially playing, 3 to 5 games over just as many days, is there kind of what's kind of the standard in terms of general guidance or perhaps preparation for the week before to your knowledge and understanding?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, Michael, and I think it's a very tough one to convince people that that you can do anything to prepare yourself for 4 games in such a short span of time. So what Tom has done and has illustrated is exactly kind of where you want to be. You don't want players going into a match day under fatigue, and you know that after the first game with the congestion of the fixtures, there's literally no way that freshness is going to be 100% physiologically speaking, going into the next one and then to the next one and to the next one. It's just the way that the fixtures are lined up. Unless you have 22 players on the roster, alternating 11, the 11 on one match, 11 on the other. To maximize freshness to 100%, I would say is impossible, which makes the week leading up to those games so much more important or so much more critical, in that you don't overload and overextend boundaries to potentially carry fatigue into that first game, because ultimately, ideally, with the travel and going into that first match, there's going to be fatigue carried over into the next match, simply because it's the next day, and there's the ability to recover between that training stimulus or that activity is just impossible to do. So what Tom has done, exposed them to a very low level intensity bout, but that's going to be enough to tick them over and carry them into the game with sharpness, versus extending those boundaries beyond 60, 70, 80%, which is going to inevitably, more than likely, take them into leading to that first match under fatigue. So I think the plan was executed well, and I think the results and the play leading to those results speak for themselves. And obviously the physical component of it is a component. It's not the end all be all, but you have to be able to exert some physical abilities to execute the technical and tactical plan. So I would say, well done, Tom.
I think one of the things I noticed when just taking a glance at the '04 boys game data was that in their first game, the one they played on Friday, their distance was the lowest out of the 4 that they played, but their heart rate, their minutes above 80% was actually the highest compared to the other 4 games. So I think that's kind of reflective of perhaps what we were talking about. Did you witness, or with your own eyes, Tom, that first game? Did it seem to be a bit of a struggle, I guess, for both teams?
Yeah, I think it was always, when you're dealing with young players, I'm always very cognizant of us sounding like a broken record or saying something that perhaps they don't believe is true until they've actually lived it. So the warnings that we had given in the weeks preceding the event of, fellas, this is going to be hard. Like, this is, please don't underestimate the challenge of playing um, at a level above sea level that you're not accustomed to, in temperatures that we're not really accustomed to. Um, and I ultimately think as well, there's a degree of anxiety and nervousness, it being their first, their first kind of time appearing at that stage. So there's a level of somatic kind of anxiety where the heart rate might be elevated as well. So I think it really doesn't surprise me that when you put all of those factors together, that was the type of the type of data that we witnessed. I do definitely think it got easier for them as the event went on, just in terms of the duration that they could play without needing quote unquote a break. The temperatures also dropped from being very high to a little lower. So again, you put everything together, mate, and it makes perfect sense why that first day especially, we would have seen that, though it's just simply harder to cover more ground. So again,
and that was a trend. Sorry, Tom, I was just going to say to reflect that was a trend that we saw with both teams' data actually is kind of a reversal happen. So even though when they were playing their semifinals and finals respectively, they covered the most distance in those games compared to the previous ones, but their heart rate was actually lower as an average for a team. So yeah, that was definitely reflected in the data as well.
Yeah, and I think Steve can shed a little bit more light, but I do think it's really kind of worth drawing attention to in that moment. Being able to deep dive into the data a little bit and understand the environmental influence or factors that may be affecting performance. It's not as simple as just looking, assuming something. We've got to kind of know again a little bit about what might be playing into the why behind what the data is saying. So yeah, definitely interesting, but certainly something where I'm very acutely aware of the challenges for all of the teams involved in the event of what the temperatures were those first few days, because the heat and humidity was astonishing. And ultimately tying it back to the first practice session that we just discussed, I think that played a large part on why maybe the heart rate was elevated a little bit more, and the time spent above 80% in that kind of pre-trip training session was maybe 5 to 7 minutes higher than perhaps I would have anticipated it being based on the practice design. But when you're contending with 90 and 100-degree heat, obviously the impact that has on the body is a significant one. So
yeah, and I'm curious about altitude, Steve. Like, is there, how much can you expect for it to be more taxing on the athletes just by the very fact that they're playing, a few thousand meters higher altitude compared to what they're used to?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great illustration that it's a situation that greatly affects outputs, because the cost of putting energy into something is much greater, and it has to happen at a much greater rate. And when you don't have oxygen in the air that you're used to help supply, the body with the necessary, I won't say substrate, I'll say ingredients, okay, to create the energy that's required, naturally you're going to not be able to do as much work. That's the bottom line. And on the flip side, how awesome is it that the adaptation for just being there for a few days, the body figures it out and sorts it out. So, I think, just to answer, to be quite honest, I think it's a great illustration. You can't take environmental factors for granted when you're looking at a training session, you're judging the training session, or you're judging a performance. These are all very real things, which I think is a great illustration of why it's so important to understand objectively, both subjectively but also objectively, kind of where you are from an output standpoint, because responses are going to be very different depending on not just environmental factors, but also what is that student, or what is that particular athlete going through in that moment? Are they having difficulties in school? Are they stressed because of things going on at home? Who knows? So all of these things affect outputs, which ultimately affect performance. And it's not linear. Everything matters. So the more objective I think that we can be with things just as something as simple as heart rate and data that the Beyond Pulse metrics allows us to view. It allows us to be a little bit more critical in our planning and our decision making. And I think at the very least, it's informing us and it's bringing in information into our thoughts, and that's all you can ask for when looking at the data. It's not an end all be all, but there's a lot of correlations that you can draw from it. And I just heard Tom say it. Looking at it at the beginning of his week, it looks low, but that's all you need to turn over. However, he just reflected and said, maybe I was just a little bit higher on that day. Right there, that automatically makes Tom a better all-around coach, especially from the physical side of things. To recognize the environment he's going in, and to tailor the training. Tom, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that was my interpretation from what you just said, from based off of your analysis.
Yep. Okay, so we looked, obviously we talked about the 2 training session, and with a little bit of an exception, pretty much on for what your preparation was, your plan was. Was there anything? Were there any surprises from the data relative to the team or individual players in any of the games over that long weekend? Anything that kind of caught you by surprise, or you just weren't expecting, or an anomaly?
I'm not going to say by surprise, but I was impressed with some of the boys' abilities in game 3 and game 4 and beyond to maintain the type of output that they were capable of demonstrating. So I think if you want to jump, the semi-final in particular for the 2004s was one that a couple of the boys, I think, delivered pretty staggeringly high results. Maybe still covering over 10 or 11 kilometers from the start of the game to the end. So again, just as Steve alluded to, the ability for the body the adaptation that the bodies had gone through, and considering in game 1, some of them were, they were coming off, or they were cramping up, or, we were very conscious and intentional about hydration breaks and recovery and stretching and, ice baths and everything that we could do that was within our control to try and aid the body's recovery. But the ability for the boys, obviously at the age that they are, to still kind of produce that volume of performance output was very pleasing, and I think goes a long way to saying a conversation we had offline a couple of weeks ago was more on, as coaches, we can only really truly control what the players do in our environment, but a large part of what we have to be able to do is influence the decisions that they make when they're away from us. So a big part of what I had stressed with both of these boys' teams was the more work you do now prior to the event, the easier it's going to be once you're there. If you've built up a good aerobic threshold, a good base level of aerobic capacity, then even though it's going to be difficult, it's going to be easier for you than it would be if you'd gone in using the training sessions over 2 weeks and that's all you've done physically. So I think a couple of the boys in questions I know were very purposeful, and I actually had the parents sending me clips of them spending a little bit of time by themselves, doing just some cardio stuff, because again, as Steve will allude to, when we only get a finite portion of time to spend with the players, what they're doing off the field to prepare is equally as important as what they're doing on the field with us. So that data was really pleasing for a number of reasons.
Yeah, and I think you like you said, the distances, the output in terms of distance, but also the high speed running, it remained consistent throughout each of the games. So where you may expect it to dip a little bit, especially as they start getting into game 4 and game 5, it actually maintained throughout. So you could see there was, at least from a physical, the physiological data, they seem to be getting stronger every game, which is pretty
Yeah,
cool. I
yeah.
see.
No, and I think there's a blend there as well, though, Michael, in terms of some of the things that we try to kind of reinforce in terms of it's going off on a small tangent, but some of the non-negotiables that I think are so important um, to coaches in the youth space in terms of mentality and we talk about your concentration, your attitude, your response, your effort, things that ultimately only you are responsible for. And if you can come off the field truly believing that you're the hardest working team and you've given everything, then you heighten your likelihood of success. So, the boys, it was great. We had, obviously, Willow was with us the final training night, and everyone was together, and him sharing some experiences of, look, when times get tough, then the things that you value the most can't be the glory, they can't be the end product. It's got to be your willingness to defend, your willingness to dig in, your willingness to grind, your willingness to hurt and to suffer, and to be able to overcome the ugly side of the game before the nice things will follow. So for the guys to be able to maintain this was obviously incredibly pleasing, but was credit to their, I think, psychological as well as just physical strength. From a coaching perspective, everything that the support staff and myself have been able to encourage and those guys embrace was really great, because I think when you can blend the two, then obviously good things can happen.
Yeah, for sure. There's something I'd love to just revisit quickly or go back to. Obviously a big focus of this case study was obviously on tournament soccer, right? So something you mentioned was the importance of rest and recovery between games, and some of the mechanisms for that. And I'm just curious to hear Steve's perspective on this. What do you think is the optimal, or some of the perhaps easiest? Not everyone has access to an ice bath, for example, in youth sports. So during tournament soccer, what are perhaps some of the most efficient or effective rest and recovery techniques, I guess, that you can think of or recommend between games?
Yeah. So without being sexy about it, the two most important for me are sleep
Yeah.
and fueling, or said another way, nutrition. In between the matches. If you look at the goal of recovery, is as soon as the session's done, you're trying to recover from that stimulus. You're trying to get yourself back to a neutral state, okay, to a very get yourself back to zero. Hopefully you've improved a little bit, and you've adapted positively a little bit. Sleep and fueling are the easiest and most effective ways to drive recovery. Other ways to supplement, of course, are going to be low aerobic activity to help circulate, byproduct of, or stuff that gets dumped into the body when you do hard work, and you need to get rid of that bad stuff, because it makes the body less efficient as far as getting an output. And a great example of that would be, I would be curious to hear, Tom mentioned that the group on the third and fourth day had significant outputs. I'd be curious to hear what the heart rate response was over those 2 days. If the heart rate response was actually, even though the outputs were the same, if they were higher from day 1 to day 2. Do you remember that, Tom?
Do you know what? I actually don't.
Yeah.
I think they were lower.
They were lower. Then that's super, super impressive. And I would say is abnormal in a lot of situations, but it's probably because, going back to what Tom said, because they were prepared for the demands and they were able to adapt quickly. If they weren't doing those little intangibles, the things that you can't see when they're not with them, building aerobic capacity, the recovery from day to day would 100% for sure be lower, which is, I think, is a great, just a great illustration of, it's not what you do during training
Mm-hmm.
from the physical side. It's so much of it is, are you recovering between training sessions positively, pushing that line higher up so that you can tolerate the stresses as they come? And clearly, Tom has done that with his group. So that's really impressive, and I think a great illustration of how you can use this data to help determine if your strategies are working.
Yeah.
And
And
go on, Tom.
I was just going to say, obviously, a part of this is I think sharing ideas for the benefit of others that will be in similar situations. So, by no means, Sophie, do I want to present the idea that we had an array of facilities that were anything like luxurious. We didn't, but obviously, most of the teams that are traveling to events, the events strongly recommend that you're staying in hotel facilities. Most hotels have pools. So, Steve, to your point, like our boys would get in, would do a very light pool session.
Beautiful.
But again, to flush out a little bit, and we'd be in the pool. Families went one of two ways. They could pick up a small paddling pool from Walmart or any of the major department stores, and a couple of bags of ice, and we would create our own ice bath and do it that way. Or obviously they'd fill up the bathtubs. So it's not like it's anything like a professional setup, but it's again a large part of what we're trying to do is replicate best practice wherever possible and limit excuses, because we could hide behind the fact that we didn't have people there. But ultimately, the same with the choices that the players are making away from the field. Something that I try to stress a lot is ultimately remember why we're here. And it only takes, especially at that age that the boys are, and any of these kind of the adolescent groups, the 14, 15, 16, 19s, the players are like dominoes, right? When one falls, the rest will crumble. And basically the challenge is don't be that guy. And if somebody's looking like they're going to be that guy, rein them back in. Because ultimately, at that level, when everybody's incredibly capable and everybody's worked incredibly hard to be here, your mentality and your commitment, your dedication, your sacrifice, those are things that are going to separate and define whether or not you achieve what you say or claim you're hoping to achieve. So I think a collective consciousness and a culture that is kind of pushing together, as opposed to one that's going to hide behind excuses or be willing to cut corners. I think that was a huge difference with both of the groups, that they truly invested in and believed in what they were there to try and achieve, and did everything that they could within their control to make sure that they gave themselves the best possible chance of that happening. So I would suggest to anybody in my position, or any coach in those events, don't hide behind the excuses, because we can find ways with a little bit of creative thinking to kind of knock them down. So especially with the recommendation that Steve's sharing in terms of what that recovery process should look like. Find a way, right? Because if you don't,
find a way. Simple things work the best.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. Tom, I'm curious as well. It may sound like a bit of a boring question, but just because I hear this time and time again at tournaments, is that the fact is coaches will often just have one game during the day, and a lot of the time they don't know what to do with the kids for the rest of the day, right? So it's kind of a pretty interesting one. So I'm just curious, what were you doing during the day? Obviously, you've got your game time that you work towards, but you've got many hours that the kids are awake, and active and wanting to do something. How did you kind of structure your days to kind of make sure that they were maintaining a level of rest, but also trying to avoid any sort of serious boredom and all that sort of thing, all the challenges that youth coaches have when they go and do these tournaments?
Yeah.
Curious how you guys did it.
Yeah, so we were actually pretty lucky with the schedule, and I think to give US Club credit, excuse me, the facilities at Dick's where we were in Denver were incredible, and it meant that games we were basically played within 3 time slots. So
Mm.
all of our games in group stage at least kicked off at either 10, 12, or 2. The 04s were 12 o'clock every day. The 03s had a 10 a.m. and 2 p.m.s. So ultimately, everybody was able to have a pretty structured routine of breakfast together as a group,
Yeah.
and then gradually make their way to the field. So obviously, whichever team played first, big part of our club culture and ethos is that if we're there together, we support one another. So obviously, players had to be there, 45 minutes prior to their kickoff anyway to begin, just to start to get changed, and then 30 minutes before we'll start to warm up. But if they played the second game of the day, they were asked to arrive at the start of the first game so they could obviously be a support mechanism first and foremost, and then kind
Mm.
of get into things. And then conversely, outside of getting some water back on board, and parents were asked to bring, granola bars, bananas, like protein bars, just as an immediate, quick replenishment. Again, the teams were asked to kind of stay for at least 45 minutes just to show a willingness to support one another. So there was a little bit of time that was taken up by that. And then honestly, it was that a good lunch as we spoke about was incredibly important. Evening plans would be something team orientated, but usually around a meal or a low risk and low physical output activity. So there was a soccer
Oh,
game. Yeah, there was a soccer game that a couple of the guys went to see. There was a movie night. We contemplated taking a trip into the mountains and then kind of thought better of it.
yeah.
So it's always, again, it's very difficult in youth sports because I think for coaches, we can't underestimate the fact that it costs families an awful lot of money to have their children playing in events nationwide, right? And to fly a family across country. For many of ours, it was an opportunity to take a family vacation. But obviously, we couldn't perceive it as a vacation because we were there to try to complete, to fulfill a goal, to complete a task, however we might look at it. But our guys were really quite good at, look, allow the boys to spend as much time together off the field as possible, but just keep it low key. So if it's in a pool and it's in the swimming pool after they've done a little bit of a walk and a short swim, they could do a little bit there. Again, movies, meals, just stuff that's based around social interaction and togetherness, but nothing that was going to negatively inhibit their ability to go again the next day. I don't think there is a magic wand. In other occasions, I've been fortunate enough where we've been able to do video analysis pretty much kind of straight after the fact. So the games get
Mm.
recorded, we spend some time breaking them down, we go over pertinent things. Again, it's ultimately, what are we there to achieve? If we're there for a vacation, maybe that stuff's going to be perceived as a little more mundane and a little more redundant. But if we're there to truly be able to compete against, the other top clubs across the nation, then our ability to find an extra percent or two might be the difference. And as a coach, we've got to be prepared to do it, but as a player, they've also got to be receptive to that as well. And I think, not that we're in this situation in the summer, but some of the big events like the Dallas Cup, when we take kids out of school, we have to mandate study hours as well. So we put them, Steve, I don't know whether the boys in Arizona have to do the same thing, but we'll put the kids kind of an hour and a half a day in study hall when we're on the road, in season when they're away from school as well, because obviously we can't underestimate the importance of that stuff as well. So yeah, no golden rule, Michael, but plenty of opportunities to keep them together.
Yeah, and I'm sure Steve, you have your staff have the challenge of at the pro level as well, right? Especially when you're traveling for 2, 3, maybe even 4 days at a time, it's managing that time for an entire team, for a squad, which may even be more difficult for the pros. I don't know. But it's a challenge that coaches have at the youth level. When they're off, they're gone. There's a slightly different perspective with families are going out there. They want to go and do things. They want to be tourists and have a holiday as well. So it's striking that balance between, okay, yeah, we want you to do those things, but we also, like Tom said, we have a job to do. So I know it's a very real challenge for coaches who go and attend these events, and I'm sure it can also be challenging at the pro level, even when they're there to do a job, right?
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. And I think, what Tom is saying, at least, when expectations are set, there's a bit of a routine. There's a bit of a routine that, some things are gonna get done. Our routine on the road or the challenge is typically how do you find guys work who don't necessarily play in the match, and a lot of what that looks like is two groups after a game. We always stay somewhere that has access to a gym and access to a pool. So just as a quick little example is, guys that play over 60 minutes typically will have a regen session in the morning, and then the group, the seven guys, maybe sometimes 8 guys that don't get those minutes. If we don't, tick them over after the game, they'll always do at least a strength session while the regen session's going on, and then also they'll do some sort of conditioning if we don't get it in, depending on the result the night before.
Did Tom, did you do that throughout the tournament? Like, I'm sure you rotate your players quite a lot, so they all probably got a pretty good workout just from the games. But did you have to do any sort of individualization, throughout those 3 or 4 days?
No, there was nothing. Some of the boys were coming back from actually coming back from pretty moderately lengthy spells on the sidelines. So for them, there was a little heightened need for extra activation pre-game. We kind of took the approach of, we're not gonna, in the heat, in tournament football, multiple games in a row, we weren't warming up for 45 minutes, an hour prior to a game. We were really, it was a little more condensed. So boys that need a little bit more time to get, they would start earlier. But really, apart from that kind of earlier activation to just try and loosen them up, that were a little bit more with muscle soreness and DOMs after playing, there wasn't anything that really stood out. It was more the boys being mature enough to say, this hurts, this doesn't, I'm good, I'm bad, I need a little bit of extra attention here. Obviously, the events do a great job with the athletic trainers being on site, and they can kind of get immediate attention if there's anything that's specifically bothering them. But I didn't, maybe it's an anomaly, but I didn't feel like we had to have any extra attention per se to kind of anybody, just to help kind of get them through things, maybe somewhat fortuitously, I guess.
Yeah. I think it's a different thing, right? At the youth level, at least, and typically you're not managing the same number of players as a pro team would be, right?
Yeah,
so you're spread across multiple games, whereas I think Steve's referencing, a travel weekend when they're playing one game, right? So they have to,
for sure. And obviously, the other thing to address with this data is the rules on fixed substitutions were lifted because of the heat. So people were able to get exit and re-enter in as many times in each half as they pleased, and there was water breaks added. So US club did a great job of managing, obviously, the challenging impact, at least for the first. That was the case for, I think, the first 2 games, maybe first 3. It was definitely lifted in the semi-final and final, when the heat index reduced. But all of those things obviously come into consideration as well, because it wasn't like I had any player that only got 10 minutes or 15 minutes in a game. So
Yeah.
we were in a position where everybody was contributing, everybody was active, everybody was sharing a load. Nobody needed a quote unquote booster, and nobody was forced to be in a position where they were required to move to the point where they were totally exhausted. We were given those opportunities for rest periods to be punctuated. So definitely, different, right? I'll hold my hands up. It's definitely different. 2 weeks previously, in EMPL in Chicago, it was fixed, so we didn't have that luxury, and it definitely changes your coaching approach and things that we have to think about with rotation and squad selection, game selection. The data is so incredibly useful in terms of maintaining the most ready team being on the field, whether it's starting games or finishing games. We're highly conscious of the data that presents an idea of what physical load the players have taken on board, and their capability to, sustain or meet the demands of the game when substitutions are limited, which is obviously an environment that Steve works in on a daily basis. So, I do think it's worth referencing environmentally how much of an impact those rules that are completely external and completely non-controllable by you can have on the selections and the decisions that you have to make as a coach.
So that with youth sport and tournament style, I mean, you're kind of at the mercy. The important thing is that they're prepared for it. And one of the ways, a simple way to know if they're ready for it or prepared, is to always see the response. So what does the next day look like? Are they coming to you with knee soreness, hamstring tightness, low back tightness? Do they have a higher resting heart rate, going into the game from their norm? All of those are indicators of they haven't returned back to neutral, or the external loads that they've received were too much, because those are all negative. I shouldn't say negative. The elevated heart rate response is normal when you're still under fatigue and you're trying to adapt, right? If they don't, then they're a unit. You know what I mean? They're an absolute unit, and they can keep going. But muscle soreness is such a powerful and underlooked thing when it comes to it, because that tells you they weren't ready for the training or for the stimulus. If they're reporting like sharpness, or what are they prepared for? That should always be the question. And within the team, the individuals are going to be so variant. There's going to be so much difference between a person, So there's guys here that can handle crazy amounts of work, and there's other guys they can't. Can't. They aren't built physically. They're not built for it. Over 80% of the time, they're 80% of their max heart rate. Their output is either, if your output's lower than what that usually is, then that's a red flag, because now it's costing them more to do less work, right? Or if it's the same, you then begin to ask yourself, well, what's a normal output for them during a game? And you can say to yourself, holy smokes, we're like getting 2 games, 3 games of this type of number in a week's time. That's a massive stressor. You don't need to, this guy is going to need some time to get himself back to neutral. Does that make sense?